Hi, I'm Pearl Dexter. I've been in the tea business for over 35 years. First as a tea proprietress at the Old English Tea Room in Scotland, Connecticut, and then later as the publisher and editor of Tea, a magazine which I owned for 18 years. I'm here today to talk to you about tea in America. We have been drinking tea since the 17th century in America. The Dutch and the British brought it over, and it became, by the 18th century, the handmaiden of fashion and refinement. It was a social life all around the tea table. There were three-legged tea tables, there were four-legged tea tables, and tea was so expensive that they actually used to lock it up. This is a tea caddy that I brought back from England some years ago, and I don't have the inside part of it, but oftentimes these tea caddies would have 2 or 3 compartments where they might blend the tea or mix it with sugar. In fact, if you're interested in the history of tea, there's a great museum in Salem, Massachusetts called the Peabody Essex Museum, and it depicts the whole processing and growing of tea, and they have a plethora of beautiful teapots and tea caddies. So we continued drinking tea even into the 18th century. And during the 18th century, George Washington even ordered tea directly from the British in the 1750s. But it was England who upset the colonists quite a bit when they passed the Townshend Act, where they were taxing us on not just tea, but almost everything else. And in 1772, a British ship called the Gaspee was docked in Rhode Island in an area called Nanquit Point, and we burned the ship. That was a precursor to that big Boston Tea Party that most of you know about. And it wasn't just the Boston Tea Party where we threw the tea overboard. We either threw it overboard, we burned the ships, or sent the ships back to England from Boston to New York to Greenwich, New Jersey, Philadelphia, Chestertown, Maryland, Charleston, South Carolina, and Edenton, North Carolina. Well, the Revolutionary War came along, and George Washington was a big tea drinker, as I said earlier, and he, in fact, even made tea available to his officers. There were many people in the country at that time that didn't want to drink tea because they thought that it would be sympathetic to the British. And after the war was over, a lot of those people who were sympathetic to the British moved to Nova Scotia and Canada and other parts of the world. We were a nation of immigrants, and some of our immigrants from Germany and even England and France and Bostonians who were born here, they started an industry in shipping. They built ships so that we could go to China and deal directly with the Chinese on the goods that we wanted, and especially the tea. And the very first ship that they built was called the Empress of China. Well, they'd bring back other things besides tea, and then later, of course, we went into another war, the War of 1812. Well, that set us back a little bit too. We didn't have a fleet of ships as a navy, so we had to use the ships that those early Americans had built, and we lost a lot of them during the War of 1812. And in about 1830-something, an American by the name of McKim, he took that old schooner design and he redesigned it so that it would sail across the seas a little bit faster so that we could get our goods back from China and other places quicker than those old schooners took to get there and back. They were then named the clipper ships. And we weren't just making them at that time. Even the British started to make clipper ships. And we would sometimes race with them from Fuzhou, China, to our port in New York or Philadelphia, and they would go to London to see who could get back to their port the quickest, because whoever brought the tea back first could ask a pretty price for it. So the clipper ships actually made tea much more affordable. We didn't have to lock it away in little tea caddies anymore. And it was available to not just the wealthy people in America, but it was available to the average working man or woman. And it became not just a fashionable thing to do, but it became part of our daily life. Tea was a beverage that we drank in the morning and in the evening. It wasn't just something for a special occasion. And tea was being grown now in the mid-1800s, not just in China, but it was being grown in India, in Ceylon, in Java, Sumatra, and even in the United States, we experimented with growing tea. Of course, during the 19th century, we had not just one war, but several wars. We had the Civil War, then we had the Spanish-American War. By the turn of the 20th century, we were drinking a lot of tea from all over the world. In fact, at the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair, someone took the tea because it was a hot day and they poured it over ice. And in the United States today, most of the tea that we consume is iced tea. And a little bit later, somebody sent a sample of tea in a little silk pouch. And somebody poured hot water over that, and voila, the tea bag was born. In 1937, a company from Connecticut called the Dexter Corporation, they invented the paper that is now used to make tea bags so that you can put the tea in this paper bag. Those are sold throughout the world. Well, because tea was so affordable in the 20th century, it wasn't too long before women started to open little tea rooms, whether they took a room in their home, a colonial house like this one, or if they took their barn and converted it to a place to serve tea in a light fair or a shed, or just serving tea in the garden. A lot of women were widows, there were single women, and it was a time when women could not really go to a pub or a tavern by themselves unescorted, but it was quite all right for women to go to the tea rooms alone and maybe meet up with a friend and have a little tete-a-tete. Tea rooms were run by women mainly, and they were all over the United States of America. It gave them a way to have an income, and it also gave women an opportunity to go out and meet with their friends and family. My mom even told me that in the 30s, she worked in a tea room as a teenager. So I remember one of my favorite tea rooms was in Providence, Rhode Island. It was called Miss Shepherd's Tea Room. And sometimes after school, on my way home, a friend and I would stop there to have a spot of tea and maybe a piece of chocolate cake. Well, these tea rooms started to close in the late 50s and 60s, and there were not a lot of tea rooms until there was a little bit of a revival in the 80s. When I returned from England in 1985, my niece and I opened the Old English Tea Room in Scotland, Connecticut. In the 1990s, I started to help other people open tea rooms all over the United States. I went to locations, helped them choose locations, taught them how to open a tea room or a tea shop. And to this day, there are tea rooms from the East Coast to the West Coast, from the north to the south, and in the middle of the country also. We have learned so much about tea, and many of my tea colleagues and I have traveled to the tea-producing countries. I've been to China, Japan, I've been to Sri Lanka, India, even Portugal, where they grow tea. And I did go to that tea plantation down in South Carolina quite some time ago. I am proud of the contribution that we Americans have made to the world of tea today. There are artists that are painting pictures about tea. There are writers writing books about tea. There are people writing music about tea. We are a nation of tea drinkers. And I want to raise my cup to you and thank you for joining me today. Please like and subscribe, and until next time, cheers.